Welcome to Life Stories, where we share unforgettable journeys that touch the heart and soul. Today, we delve into a tale of love, betrayal, and redemption. Emily and Jonathan seemed like the perfect couple, pillars of faith and inspiration to their community. But behind closed doors, cracks began to form, unraveling a life they had carefully built together. What happens when the weight of secrets becomes too much to bear? Join us as we uncover their story and the profound lessons they learned about grace, forgiveness, and resilience. Don't forget to subscribe and begin this journey with us today. In the vibrant city of Chicago, nestled between bustling streets and towering skyscrapers, stood Grace Fellowship Ministry, a church renowned for its sermons on love and redemption. Every Sunday, the pews overflowed with families, couples, and individuals seeking guidance and solace. At the heart of this spiritual sanctuary was Pastor Jonathan, a tall man with a commanding presence and a voice that resonated with authority and compassion. But it wasn't just Jonathan who drew the crowds, it was his wife, Emily, who captured the hearts of the congregation. Emily was the epitome of grace and elegance. Her flowing dresses and serene demeanor seemed to radiate light, making her a beacon of hope for everyone who met her. Her sermons, though fewer than her husband's, were no less impactful. When she spoke, particularly to women, her words were infused with wisdom and warmth. "Respect your husbands," she would say, her voice steady yet soothing. "A peaceful home is a blessed home." The women of the congregation admired her deeply, aspiring to embody her calm strength and unwavering faith. To them, Emily was more than a pastor's wife, she was a role model, a friend, and an inspiration. At home, Emily and Jonathan lived in a beautiful house with polished wooden floors, tall windows, and a lush garden. Their life seemed picture-perfect. Jonathan often reminded Emily of how much she meant to him, calling her his gift from God. She would smile at his words, her eyes sparkling with affection. Yet beneath the surface, Emily felt a growing void she couldn't ignore. Jonathan's role as the pastor of a large church consumed much of his time and energy. His days were filled with meetings, counseling sessions, and preparations for Sunday services. By the time he came home, he was often exhausted, barely managing a tired smile before retreating to his study or falling into bed. Emily tried to understand. She told herself that this was the life they had chosen, a life devoted to serving others. But late at night, as she lay beside Jonathan, who fell asleep almost as soon as his head hit the pillow, she felt an ache in her heart that she couldn't explain. Their home, once filled with laughter and shared dreams, grew quieter. Conversations became transactional about the church, schedules, and upcoming events. Emily, who had once found joy in organizing charity drives and preparing meals for Jonathan, began to feel like a shadow in her own life. One sunny Saturday afternoon, as Emily helped prepare food for a church charity event, a little girl named Tessa ran into the kitchen, her pigtails bouncing. "Look, Mama Emily, I drew a picture," she exclaimed, holding up a crayon drawing of a family, a father, mother, and child. Emily's heart tightened. She and Jonathan didn't have children, a subject that weighed heavily on her mind. They had prayed and hoped for years, but nothing had changed. Emily often wondered if this absence was part of the emptiness she felt. She knelt beside Tessa, her smile soft but her heart heavy. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Emily said, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's face. But the image lingered in her mind, a poignant reminder of what her life lacked. That evening, as Emily and Jonathan sat on their porch sipping tea, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink, Emily decided to voice her feelings. "Do you ever feel like something's missing?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Jonathan looked at her, his brow furrowing. "Missing? Like what?" Emily hesitated, unsure how to put her thoughts into words. "The loneliness. The quiet nights. The feeling of being unseen, it all felt too overwhelming to articulate. Instead, she shook her head. Never mind. I'm just being silly. Jonathan reached for her hand. His gaze warm and sincere. Emily, you're my everything. If something's bothering you, tell me. Emily forced a smile, squeezing his hand. I'm fine. Jonathan. Really. To the outside world, Emily and Jonathan were the perfect couple. Their love, their faith, and their life seemed unshakable. But within the walls of their beautiful home, Emily's heart carried a weight that no one could see. And as she looked out at the stars that night, she couldn't have imagined how quickly her carefully constructed world was about to change. A week later, Emily found herself at a grand fundraising dinner for the church. The event was held at an opulent hotel in downtown Chicago, with glittering chandeliers, elegant floral arrangements, and a soft murmur of jazz filling the air. Jonathan had been unable to attend, tied up with a last-minute counseling session. So Emily had gone alone. She moved through the room gracefully, exchanging pleasantries with donors and church members. Her smile was warm, her laugh light, and yet, she felt a strange detachment, as though she were watching herself from the outside. Toward the end of the evening, as she sipped a glass of sparkling water, a man approached her. "Good evening, Mrs. Emily," he said, his voice smooth and confident. He was tall, with an air of self-assurance that bordered on charm. "You're even more radiant in person than I'd imagined." Emily felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "Thank you," she said politely. The man introduced himself as Henry, a successful entrepreneur and philanthropist. Their conversation flowed easily, and for the first time in a long while, Emily felt genuinely seen. Henry listened intently, laughed at her jokes, and complimented her insights. It was a stark contrast to the hurried, distracted conversations she had grown accustomed to at home. As the evening wore on, Henry leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're an incredible woman, Emily. It's hard to believe someone like you could ever feel lonely." Emily froze, her heart skipping a beat. How could he know? She laughed nervously, brushing off his comment and changing the subject. But his words lingered long after she left the event. Over the next few days, Emily found herself thinking about Henry more than she should have. She dismissed it as a passing fancy, a harmless acknowledgement of a fleeting moment. But fate seemed to have other plans. One afternoon, as Emily sat in a quiet corner of a cafe reviewing notes for an upcoming sermon, Henry appeared again. "Fate seems to keep bringing us together," he said with a charming smile. Emily hesitated. She knew she should excuse herself. But instead, she stayed. They talked for hours, their conversation weaving between light-hearted anecdotes and deeper reflections. Henry was attentive and engaging, qualities Emily hadn't realized she missed so desperately. One meeting turned into another, and before long, Emily found herself sneaking out to see him. What began as innocent chats over coffee escalated into dinners at exclusive restaurants and evenings at luxurious lounges. For the first time in years, Emily felt alive. Henry's attention filled the void in her heart, the emptiness that had plagued her nights. Yet, with every outing, the weight of guilt grew heavier. "I shouldn't be doing this," Emily whispered one evening as they sat on a balcony overlooking the shimmering city lights. Henry reached for her hand, his gaze steady. "You deserve to be happy, Emily. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." His words comforted her in the moment, but they couldn't quiet the storm inside her. At home, Emily continued to play the role of the perfect pastor's wife. She preached sermons about obedience and respect in marriage, her voice steady even as her heart raced with shame. "Your husband is your king," she told the women at a missionary event. "Serve him with love and honor." The applause that followed made her stomach churn. She was living a double life, and the cracks in her facade were growing wider. Jonathan, ever perceptive, began to notice her growing distance. One Sunday afternoon, as they sat on the porch, He reached for her hand. "Emily, are you okay?" he asked. His voice filled with concern. Emily forced a smile. Looking away. "I'm fine. Just tired from the week." Jonathan kissed her forehead. "Maybe you should take a break. You've been working so hard." His kindness only deepened her guilt. She wanted to stop. To return to the life she and Jonathan had built together. But the pull of her secret life was strong. And each time she tried to end things with Henry, he convinced her otherwise. "You bring light into my life," he would say. His voice soft but persuasive. And for a moment, Emily would believe him. The double life Emily led began to unravel one fateful night. Henry had invited her to an exclusive party at a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Chicago. It was the kind of event she'd only seen in movies. With opulent decor, champagne flowing freely, and a sea of glamorous people. For a few hours, Emily allowed herself to get swept up in the atmosphere, forgetting the weight of her responsibilities. She laughed, danced, and felt the rush of freedom that had become so intoxicating. But what she didn't realize was that someone from her church was at the same party. A quiet man named Marcus, who worked as a sound technician for the church, had been hired to assist with the event's audio. He stayed in the shadows, unnoticed by most. But his sharp eyes couldn't miss Emily's vibrant presence. Shocked and confused, Marcus discreetly recorded a few moments of her dancing and laughing with Henry, their intimacy unmistakable. The following morning, Emily's world shifted dramatically. She received an anonymous text message with a video attached. Her hands trembled as she played it. Watching herself on the screen, Henry's hand rested on her waist as they shared a quiet laugh. The accompanying message read, N10.000.000 or the congregation sees this. Emily felt her stomach drop. Panic surged through her as she stared at the words. The perfect life she had built with Jonathan. The respect she held in the church. The admiration of the community, it all hung by a thread. 4 days. She could barely eat or sleep. Her mind raced with possibilities. But none seemed viable. The blackmailer's demand was astronomical. Far beyond what she could afford. Yet the thought of Jonathan discovering the truth, or worse, the entire church, was unbearable. Desperation drove her to pay the initial demand. She drained her savings, transferring the money to the account provided in the message. For a brief moment, she felt a flicker of relief, believing the nightmare was over. But it wasn't. A week later, another message arrived. The demand had grown. N50.000.000 or everyone knows who you really are. Emily sat frozen, the phone slipping from her hand onto the table. She realized she was trapped, caught in a web of her own making. No matter how much she paid, it would never end. At home, the strain began to show. Jonathan noticed her anxiety, her distant demeanor. "Emily, something's wrong," he said one evening as they sat on the couch. "You can talk to me." She forced a smile. "I'm just overwhelmed with church responsibilities. I'll be fine." But Jonathan wasn't convinced. His concern deepened as the days passed. And Emily's behavior grew more erratic. The breaking point came one evening when she met Marcus in a dimly lit bar, hoping to confront him and find a way out of the mess. He was younger than she expected, his sly grin making her skin crawl. "What do you want from me?" Emily demanded, her voice trembling. "I've already paid you." Marcus leaned back in his chair, sipping his drink with infuriating calm. "It's simple. Mrs. Emily. More money. And don't even think about going to the police. Imagine what your congregation would think if they saw that video. Imagine Jonathan's face." His words were like knives, cutting into her deepest fears. "I don't have that kind of money," she said, her voice breaking. Marcus shrugged. "Then you'd better find a way. You're resourceful, aren't you?" 4 days. Emily racked her brain for a solution. She couldn't tell Jonathan, he would demand to know everything. And the truth would destroy him. Selling her jewelry or even their home wouldn't raise enough. She felt the walls closing in. The weight of her lies suffocating her. One sleepless night, as she sat in the darkened living room, Emily made a decision. She picked up her phone, her hand steady for the first time in weeks, and called Marcus. "Do whatever you want," she said, her voice firm despite her racing heart. "I'm not paying you another cent." His cold laughter on the other end chilled her to the bone. "You think you're brave now, Mrs. Emily. Let's see how brave you are when the world knows the truth." The next morning, the video went viral. The fallout from the video was immediate and devastating. By midday, Emily's phone was inundated with calls and messages. Some were from members of the congregation, their voices filled with disbelief and betrayal. Others were from strangers who had stumbled across the viral clip, their words dripping with venom. "Hypocrite. How could you do this to your husband? You're a disgrace to the church." The video spread like wildfire through social media, forwarded in WhatsApp groups and dissected on gossip blogs. It seemed that everyone had an opinion, and none of them were kind. At home, Emily sat frozen, staring at her phone as the notifications poured in. The house that once felt warm and inviting now seemed like a cage, each room echoing with the silence of her isolation. Jonathan returned home earlier than usual that day. His face was pale, his hands clenched into fists as he held his phone. Without a word, he placed it on the dining table, the video still playing on the screen. "Emily," he said, his voice trembling. "Tell me this isn't true." Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at him. "Jonathan, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for this to happen." His anguish was palpable, his voice breaking as he replied, "How could you? How could you do this to me? To us? To the church?" Emily fell to her knees, her hands clasped in desperation. "I made a mistake, Jonathan. A terrible mistake. But I love you. And I'm so sorry." But her apologies couldn't undo the damage. The betrayal was too deep, the trust too shattered. Jonathan turned away, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his grief. The church erupted in chaos. Congregants demanded answers, some calling for Emily to step down from her leadership roles. Others openly questioned Jonathan's ability to lead, suggesting that a man who couldn't keep his household in order was unfit to shepherd an entire congregation. The following Sunday, Jonathan stood before the church, his face drawn but composed. "My brothers and sisters," he began, his deep voice resonating through the sanctuary. "These past weeks have been some of the most challenging of my life. My wife has made grave mistakes. And while I am deeply hurt, I urge you to remember that none of us is without sin." There was a murmur among the congregation, some nodding in agreement while others remained visibly skeptical. Jonathan continued, "I ask for your prayers not only for my family but also for this church. We must remain strong in our faith, even in the face of trials." Though his words were heartfelt, the congregation remained divided. Some stood by Jonathan, admiring his strength and grace, while others couldn't reconcile the image of Sister Emily they had once revered with the woman exposed in the video. At home, the tension between Jonathan and Emily was unbearable. They barely spoke, each retreating into their own corners of the house. Emily tried to bridge the gap, but the walls between them had grown insurmountable. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dining table, Emily finally broke the silence. "Jonathan," she said softly, "can we talk?" He looked up, his eyes filled with disappointment. "What is there to talk about? Emily, you betrayed me. You betrayed God." Tears streamed down her face. "I know I did. I don't have any excuse. But I need you to understand I felt so alone." Jonathan shook his head, his voice rising with frustration. "Alone? You had me. You had this congregation. You had everything." Emily's voice broke as she replied, "You were always so busy, Jonathan. You were there for everyone else. But not for me." I was wrong, I know that, but I felt invisible in my own home. Jonathan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. So your solution was to humiliate me? To destroy everything we built together? Emily wanted to explain. To make him see how her loneliness had driven her to make terrible choices. But she knew it was futile. The damage was done. In the following days, Emily was officially removed from all church leadership roles. The missionary group she had dedicated years to cut ties with her. Even the women who had once admired her now avoided her. Their eyes filled with judgment. Emily's life continued to crumble. The once bright image of her existence reduced to a shadow of shame and regret. The church community that had once embraced her now turned its back. And she became a pariah in her own neighborhood. The whispers and judgment followed her everywhere. Each sideways glance a reminder of how far she had fallen. The media frenzy only made things worse. Gossip blogs, social media, and even local news channels dissected every detail of her scandal. Emily couldn't open her phone without seeing her name associated with words like hypocrite and disgrace. The house that once symbolized her and Jonathan's shared dreams felt oppressive. A prison filled with echoes of what was lost. Jonathan remained a stoic figure in public, continuing to lead the church with unwavering resolve. But at home, the distance between them grew unbearable. They rarely exchanged words. And when they did, it was strained and emotionless. Jonathan spent most of his time in his study, emerging only for meals or church duties. Emily attempted to reach out, but every effort felt futile. One evening, she found the courage to sit beside him as he worked. "Jonathan," she said softly, "can we start again? I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Jonathan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and exhaustion. "Emily, I don't know if I can forgive you," he said, his voice heavy. "You've broken something in me, in us, that I don't think can ever be fixed." His words cut deeply, but Emily couldn't argue. She knew the truth in them. The church elders convened a private meeting to address the fallout. Emily wasn't invited, but she could hear the low murmur of voices from the living room. When Jonathan emerged hours later, his expression was grim. "They want you gone," he said bluntly. "They believe your presence is a stain on the church's reputation." Emily's heart sank. "What about you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Do you want me gone too?" Jonathan's gaze softened for a moment before hardening again. "I don't know," he admitted. "I loved you, Emily. I gave you everything I had. But now, I don't even recognize the woman I married." The next day, Jonathan packed a small suitcase and left for a church retreat. He didn't say goodbye. Emily watched from the window as his car disappeared down the street. The weight of his absence pressing down on her like a heavy stone. Left alone, Emily was forced to confront the full consequences of her actions. The savings she had drained to pay off the blackmailer left her financially unstable. With no source of income and mounting bills, she made the painful decision to sell the house. Her new home was a small, cramped apartment in a less desirable part of town. The walls were thin, the air stale, and the constant noise from the street below a far cry from the serenity she had once enjoyed. It was a stark reminder of how far she had fallen. Despite everything, there was one person who refused to abandon her, her younger sister, Hannah. Unlike the church members, Hannah saw Emily as more than just a pastor's wife. "You're still my sister," Hannah said one evening as they sat in the tiny apartment. "You made mistakes, but that doesn't mean you're beyond redemption." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. "I don't think I'll ever be forgiven, Hannah. Not by the church. Not by Jonathan. Not even by God." Hannah took her hand, her voice firm yet gentle. "God's forgiveness isn't about what you deserve. It's about grace. You've preached that yourself, haven't you?" Emily nodded, though the words felt hollow. Weeks turned into months, and Emily began to piece together a new life. She started volunteering at a local shelter, helping women who had faced abuse and abandonment. Many of their stories mirrored her own feelings of brokenness and isolation. One evening, a young woman approached her after a group session. "Thank you for listening to me," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't think I've ever felt this understood before." For the first time in months, Emily felt a small spark of purpose. Meanwhile, Jonathan's outward success belied an internal struggle. Though the church rallied around him, he couldn't shake the lingering pain of Emily's betrayal. One night, as he sat alone in his study, he found himself scrolling through old photos of their life together. They were smiling, arms wrapped around each other, eyes filled with love and hope. He closed the album abruptly, his chest tight. Forgiveness felt impossible. Yet he couldn't ignore the ache in his heart. Months passed, and the fallout from Emily's choices continued to ripple through her life. The church community had moved on, its congregation now firmly rallying behind Jonathan. For Emily, however, the reality of her new life was a stark contrast to the one she had left behind. She remained in her small apartment, surrounded by reminders of her fall from grace. Yet, amid the despair, she began to find glimmers of hope. Volunteering at the local shelter became her sanctuary. She poured herself into helping women who had experienced hardships, offering them comfort and understanding. Each story she heard resonated with her own, their shared struggles creating a bond that transcended judgment. The women began to trust her, confide in her, and Emily found solace in being a source of support for others. One evening, a particularly young woman named Leah approached her. Leah had been silent in most sessions, her eyes always downcast. But that night, she lingered after the group had dispersed. "Emily," she began hesitantly, "I've never told anyone this. But I don't know how to forgive myself. I've done things I'm not proud of, and I feel like I'll never be whole again." Emily's heart ached at the girl's vulnerability. "Leah," she said gently, "the path to forgiveness starts with understanding that none of us are perfect. We've all made mistakes, and we all carry regrets. But those don't define who we are or who we can become." Leah looked up at her, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Do you believe that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do," Emily said, her voice steady, "because I've lived it." For the first time in months, Emily felt a sense of purpose. Though her own life was in shambles, helping others find peace gave her a reason to keep moving forward. She started to see her journey as one of rebuilding, not just herself, but others who were equally lost. Meanwhile, Jonathan was grappling with his own turmoil. The church continued to thrive, and he was praised for his resilience in the face of adversity. Yet, in the quiet moments alone, the weight of his grief was unbearable. He found himself revisiting memories of his life with Emily, moments of laughter and love that now felt like they belonged to someone else. One Sunday, Jonathan addressed the congregation with a sermon that reflected his inner conflict. "My brothers and sisters," he began, his voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "Life often brings us trials that test our faith. In those moments, it is easy to judge, to condemn, but let us remember that none of us are without sin." The congregation listened intently, some nodding in agreement while others remained skeptical. Jonathan's words carried the weight of a man who had suffered deeply, but who still clung to hope. "Forgiveness," he continued, "is not just for the one who has wronged us. It is for our own healing, to free our hearts from the chains of anger and pain." After the service, Jonathan retreated to his study, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. Could he truly forgive Emily? And even if he could, what would that mean for their future? As for Emily, she continued to attend a small church far from her old neighborhood. The anonymity of the congregation allowed her to focus on her faith without the burden of judgment. Each sermon brought her a step closer to healing, and she began to believe that redemption was possible, even for someone like her. One Sunday, the pastor spoke about the prodigal son, his voice filled with compassion. "No matter how far we stray," he said, There is always a way back. Grace is not earned, it is given freely, even to those who feel undeserving. Emily sat in the back row, tears streaming down her face as the words pierced her heart. She bowed her head, silently praying for strength and the courage to face whatever lay ahead. The journey was far from over for both Emily and Jonathan, but in their separate paths, they each began to find moments of clarity. For Emily, the road to redemption was not about erasing the past but learning from it. For Jonathan, forgiveness was a bridge he wasn't yet ready to cross, but the foundation was slowly being built. Their stories remained intertwined, even as they walked different paths, and neither could predict where those paths might eventually lead. As Emily sat quietly in her modest apartment, the weight of her journey settled around her. Though the road had been long and fraught with pain, she began to see glimmers of light breaking through the darkness. Volunteering at the shelter gave her a sense of purpose, and for the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of hope. Across the city, Jonathan continued to lead his congregation, his sermons laced with a deeper understanding of grace and forgiveness. Their paths, once joined, now diverged, each navigating their own healing. Life's challenges had taught them both profound lessons about love, betrayal, and redemption. While their futures remained uncertain, one truth emerged: even the most broken hearts could mend with time and faith. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales. Stay tuned for our next video.